The aroma of fresh coffee and the distant, mournful cry of a loon were supposed to be the soundtrack to my new life. After 20 years of a high-stress, all-consuming career in the chaotic world of software development, I had cashed out and walked away. I wasn't the CEO or the public face of the company. I was the quiet one, the guy who wrote the foundational code in a dimly lit room, the one who took a massive equity stake in the early days instead of a big salary. The company had gone public, then stratospheric, and my old friend Mark, the charismatic CEO, had become a household name. I had simply become invisible and, by any normal measure, ludicrously wealthy. My only goal now was to decompress, to reconnect with the simple things my dad had taught me: how to fix a leaky faucet, how to identify birds by their song, and, most importantly, how to fish. To that end, I bought a cottage in a community called Azure Springs. It wasn't the biggest or the newest house on the lake, far from it. It was one of the original properties, a modest, charming cedar-sided home with a sprawling, slightly wild garden and a weathered dock that had stood for 50 years. I bought it because it felt real, a welcome antidote to the sterile, glass and steel world I had just left. It was the perfect place to be normal, to be anonymous, to finally learn how to be still. The illusion of a peaceful, anonymous retirement lasted for approximately 48 hours. On my third day, while I was sitting on my dock assembling a new spinning rod, a woman appeared at the edge of my lawn. She was the platonic ideal of a certain kind of affluent suburban matriarch, tall, rail-thin, dressed in an immaculate white tennis skirt, despite the lack of any nearby court, with blonde hair sculpted into a style that looked both expensive and entirely immovable. Her face was a mask of pleasant, condescending appraisal. "You must be the new owner," she said. Her voice was light and airy, but carried an undertone of steel. It wasn't a question. "I am Tom Anderson," I said, offering a friendly smile and starting to stand up. She waved a dismissive hand, indicating I should remain seated, as if I were a servant she didn't wish to disturb. "Eleanor Vance. I am the president of the Azure Springs Homeowners Association." She delivered the title with a slight, deliberate emphasis, as if it were a rank that conferred significant power, which, in her small world, I supposed it did. Her eyes scanned my property, her gaze lingering on my slightly rusty, but perfectly reliable pickup truck in the driveway, then on the cottage's peeling paint, and finally on the simple fishing gear I was assembling. A small, tight smile played on her lips. "How quaint," she said, the word dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost syrupy. We were all quite surprised when this lot sold. We had hoped a buyer would tear down this little shack and build something more in keeping with the community's standards. I felt a prickle of annoyance, but kept my smile in place. I've always loved these old cottages. Lots of character. "Character," she repeated, tasting the word as if it were an unfamiliar and unpleasant flavor. "Indeed." Her eyes then fell to the new spinning rod in my hands. "I do hope you're not planning on using that in the lake." I was genuinely confused. "Well, yes, that's the plan. It's a fishing rod." Eleanor's smile tightened. "Mr. Anderson, Azure Springs is a premier residential community. We pride ourselves on maintaining a certain level of aesthetic tranquility. The lake is a centerpiece, an ornamental feature. It is not a common fishing hole. While the bylaws permit docks for mooring pleasure craft, the act of fishing is strictly prohibited to preserve the serene and undisturbed nature of the water. It's all in the covenant, which I trust you read before purchasing." I stared at her, dumbfounded. A lake full of fish, bordered by houses with docks, and you weren't allowed to fish in it. The logic was so profoundly and beautifully absurd that I could only blink. "I see," I finally managed to say. "I'm glad you do," she said, her voice softening now that she had established her dominance. "We have a zero-tolerance policy. A first offense warrants a warning. A second, a significant fine." She gave me a final, dismissive look over. "Welcome to the neighborhood." She turned and glided back toward her own palatial mansion, 2 houses down. Her mission accomplished. I sat on my dock, the beautiful new spinning rod feeling heavy and useless in my hands. The loon called out again, its cry now sounding less mournful and more like a mocking laugh. My quiet, simple retirement, my dream of peaceful mornings spent fishing on the lake, had just run headfirst into the immovable, irrational wall of Eleanor Vance and the Azure Springs HOA. My attempt to adhere to Eleanor's bizarre no-fishing edict lasted a full week. I busied myself with other tasks: unpacking, gardening, a bit of painting, all the while staring out at the lake, which seemed to taunt me with the occasional splash of a rising base. But my desire to live a quiet, conflict-free life was stronger than my desire to fish. I would be a good neighbor. I would follow the rules, no matter how nonsensical. My compliance, however, was not rewarded. It was interpreted as a weakness to be exploited. The first letter from the HOA arrived a week after my initial meeting with Eleanor. It was printed on thick, expensive-feeling paper, a clear signal that this was an organization with a healthy budget for official correspondence. The letter, signed with Eleanor's elegant, looping signature, was a formal warning about the fishing rod she had seen me assembling on the dock. It was my first and only warning on that particular matter. But the letter did not stop there. It went on to list a number of other newly discovered infractions. The simple, functional barbecue grill on my patio, a reliable Weber I'd owned for years, was in violation of Bylaw 214, which mandated all outdoor cooking appliances be constructed of stainless steel to maintain a uniform, high-end appearance. My humble charcoal grill was a blemish. Furthermore, the small vegetable patch I had started near the back of the cottage, a few tomato plants, some zucchini, and a row of lettuce was deemed a violation of the community's landscaping rules. Flower gardens were permitted, the letter explained, but vegetable patches were visually discordant and not in keeping with the aesthetic of an ornamental landscape. The final violation was my personal favorite. The paint I had used to touch up a few weathered spots on my dock was a shade of white that was not the official Azure Springs eggshell, a specific brand and color that had to be special ordered from a single, approved vendor 2 towns over. The letter concluded by informing me that I had 14 days to rectify these issues, or I would face an initial fine of $75 for each violation, with the fines doubling for every subsequent week of noncompliance. I read the letter, a slow, hot anger building in my chest. This wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was a targeted campaign of harassment, a clear and systematic effort to make my life so difficult, so filled with petty, expensive annoyances, that I would eventually give up and leave. That night, I had a call with Mark, my old friend and the billionaire CEO of the company we had built together. He was calling from his private jet, on his way to a product launch in Monaco. The irony was not lost on me. "So, how's the simple life, old friend?" he asked, his voice booming over the satellite connection. "Finally bored of doing nothing and ready to come back to the board?" "Not exactly," I said, looking at the violation letter on my desk. "I'm currently engaged in a high-stakes negotiation regarding the approved color palette for exterior deck sealant. It's thrilling." Mark let out a loud laugh. "Are you serious? The guy who wrote the base code for the entire genomic sequencing industry, the man whose algorithm changed the world, is worried about paint. It's a very specific shade of eggshell. Mark, I said dryly. Look, if you get bored, just remember the company's stock split again last week, he said, his tone turning more serious. Your portfolio officially crossed the ludicrously wealthy line and is now firmly in the nation-state category. You could buy that entire town, level it, and turn it into your own private fishing pond if you wanted to. I sighed. That's not the point. Mark, I don't want to be that guy. I just want to be a normal guy, living in a normal house, without being hassled. There's nothing normal about you, Tom, he said gently. You just haven't accepted it yet. Call me if you need anything. Anything at all. We hung up, and I stared at the letter. Mark was right. Of course. I could fight this with an army of lawyers. I could buy my way out of the problem. But that would be an admission of defeat. A failure in my quest to live a simple, normal life. So, I made a decision. I would comply. I would play their game, follow their ridiculous rules, and hopefully, by being the perfect, compliant resident, they would eventually just leave me alone. The next day, I drove into town and ordered a new, absurdly expensive, stainless steel grill. I went to the approved vendor and bought 2 gallons of Azure Springs eggshell dock paint, and with a heavy heart, I pulled up my promising young tomato plants. It was a strategic retreat, a sacrifice made for the promise of peace. I could not have been more wrong. My campaign of meticulous compliance did nothing to appease Eleanor. In fact, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Every rule I followed, every fine I paid, was taken as an admission of her authority, fueling her desire to find new, more creative ways to torment me. The peace I had so desperately sought was proving to be a costly and elusive commodity. As an olive branch, and as a genuine attempt to enjoy the lake in a way that didn't involve a fishing rod, I purchased a canoe. It was a beautiful, handmade cedar strip canoe, a piece of functional art that I had commissioned from a craftsman in Maine. It was elegant, silent, and, I thought, perfectly in keeping with the aesthetic tranquility Eleanor was so fond of. I had it delivered and spent a blissful afternoon paddling around the lake, the canoe gliding through the water with a grace that the lumbering pontoon boats of my neighbors could never match. It felt like a small victory, a way to connect with the water without breaking any rules. The victory was, of course, short-lived. A new letter arrived. The canoe, despite being a non-motorized vessel, was a violation. I had failed to register my watercraft with the HOA and pay the annual $50 lake usage fee. I dutifully mailed a check and a photo of my canoe for their files. A week later, I went down to the dock for an early morning paddle and found it. A long, deep, ugly scratch had been gouged into the side of the canoe, running nearly its entire length. It wasn't an accident. The mark was deliberate, the edges of the gouge sharp and clean, as if made by a screwdriver or the tip of a key. My beautiful, handmade canoe had been permanently scarred. There were no witnesses. There were no cameras. It was a perfectly deniable act of vandalism, a clear and vicious message. I felt a surge of cold fury, followed by a profound sense of violation. This had crossed a line from bureaucratic harassment into criminal property damage. That afternoon, I didn't call the local police to file a report that would go nowhere. I made a different call. I contacted a security consultant I knew from my old life, a man who specialized in protecting the private art collections and fortified homes of the ultra-wealthy. Daniel, he said, his voice calm and professional. "What's the situation?" "I have a residential security issue," I said. "A breach at a remote location. I need a full assessment of asset vulnerability and the installation of a deterrent posture." I was speaking his language, the clinical, detached jargon of high-stakes security. The asset in question was my home, my peace of mind. "Understood," he said. "What level of visibility are we talking?" "Zero." I replied. "I want a system that is functionally invisible to the naked eye. Full perimeter, high definition, night vision, audio recording, all data stored locally on an encrypted, closed-loop network. I want to be able to read a license plate from half a mile away, day or night. Money is not a concern." His team arrived 2 days later in a nondescript van from a company that supposedly installed home theater systems. They were not your typical technicians. They moved with a quiet, efficient precision, their work nearly silent. They embedded tiny, powerful cameras in trees, under the eaves of the cottage, and inside a fake rock in the garden. They installed pressure sensors under the dock planks and a sensitive directional microphone aimed at the property line I shared with Eleanor Vance. The entire system, which cost more than my pickup truck, was controlled by a single, hardened tablet. When they were finished, my modest little cottage had a security system more advanced than many banks. It was a wildly excessive response to a scratched canoe. But it wasn't about the canoe. It was about the breach. It was about the fact that someone felt they could come onto my property, damage my belongings, and get away with it. Eleanor thought she was fighting a war of attrition against a tired retiree. She had no idea she had just provoked a man who had the resources and the will to turn his small piece of land into an impregnable fortress. Having transformed my cottage into a discreet surveillance state, I waited. The footage of the canoe being scratched was inconclusive. A dark, hooded figure at 2 a.m., but the system was now in place, logging every car, every person, every conversation that crossed my perimeter. I continued my quiet routine, the perfect, compliant resident, all the while gathering data. Eleanor, deprived of any new bylaw violations to seize upon, shifted her campaign to the social front. The primary weapon in her arsenal was the glossy, professionally printed Azure Springs monthly newsletter, specifically her President's Corner column. In the next issue, nestled between an article on perennial planting and the community's social calendar, was a passive-aggressive screed clearly aimed at me. "A community is like a finely woven tapestry," she wrote. "Each thread must contribute to the overall beauty and strength of the fabric. When a new resident joins us who does not share our community's commitment to excellence, who does not appreciate the high standards we all strive to uphold, that single, weak thread can threaten the integrity of the entire piece." She went on to lament the gradual decline of certain properties and the importance of protecting our shared investment from neglect and indifference. It was classic slander by insinuation. She never used my name, but everyone in the small community knew exactly who she was talking about. I was the weak thread, the source of the decline. She escalated her social attacks at the annual Azure Springs Summer Barbecue, held at the community clubhouse. I decided to attend, hoping that a face-to-face friendly presence might dispel the rumors and show that I was not the antisocial recluse she was painting me as. The attempt was a dismal failure. As soon as I arrived, a palpable chill went through the crowd. Conversations faltered. People found reasons to move to the other side of the lawn. I tried to join a group of men by the grill, but they gave me curt, one-word answers and quickly disbanded. Then, I saw Eleanor, holding court by the drinks table. She was surrounded by a small group of her most loyal followers. As I walked past, her voice rose just enough for me to hear. "It's just so sad," she said, her voice dripping with false pity. "The poor man is obviously house poor. He inherited that little shack and clearly can't afford the upkeep. Did you see that dreadful old truck he drives? It's a miracle it even runs. One has to wonder what he even does for a living." One of her friends chimed in, "I heard he doesn't do anything. Probably living off some meager inheritance. It's a shame. That lot is the best on the lake. Imagine what a proper home would look like there." I kept walking, a hot flush of anger and humiliation creeping up my neck. I was being judged and condemned based on the car I drove and the modest size of my house. The fact that my meager inheritance was a portfolio that could buy and sell everyone at this party 10 times over was an irony so profound it was almost painful. They were measuring my worth by the things I chose not to have, by the life of quiet simplicity I had actively sought. That night, the isolation felt more acute than ever. I was an outsider in my own home, a pariah in a community of people who saw my lack of ostentation as a moral failing. I had a call with my wealth manager, a sharp, no-nonsense man named David, who had handled my finances for years. "Tom," he said, his voice crisp over the phone. "Just wanted to get your final sign-off. You're sure you want to move another $50 million into the philanthropic trust for the new children's hospital wing? It's a significant liquidation of assets." I was sitting on my porch, looking out at the dark lake, at the glittering lights of the mansions whose owners had just snubbed me for being poor. "Yes, David, go ahead with the transfer," I said, my voice quiet. "The hospital needs it more than I do." I paused. "And David, I have another project for you. I want you to look into the ownership of a small, regional development company. It's called Azure Springs Holdings LLC. I want to know everything about them, their financial situation, their assets, their debts, their shareholders, a full workup, and I need it to be discreet." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. "Azure Springs?" David asked, a note of curiosity in his voice. "Any particular reason?" "Let's just call it a potential passion project," I replied. "A very small, very local investment opportunity has presented itself." He didn't press further. "I'll have a complete dossier on your desk by the end of the week." I hung up the phone. Eleanor Vance thought she was fighting a battle over aesthetics and property values. She had no idea she had just become the subject of a deep-dive financial analysis by a team of ruthless experts who worked for a man she had dismissed as a pauper. The dossier on Azure Springs Holdings LLC arrived via a secure digital courier. It was a fascinating and, for my purposes, perfect read. The company, which had developed the community 20 years ago, had fallen on hard times. They had sold off all the housing lots, but had retained ownership of the lake itself, the dam that created it, and the small strip of shoreline that served as a community beach. It was their last significant asset, and it was heavily leveraged. The company was bleeding money, struggling to pay the taxes and maintenance costs on the lake, and was actively, if quietly, seeking a buyer. This knowledge was a powerful weapon, but one I decided to keep in reserve. My goal was still, however naively, to find a peaceful resolution. Meanwhile, Eleanor, frustrated by my continued existence, escalated her war to the next level, weaponizing the authorities. The first official visitor was a grim-faced man from the town's zoning board. "We've received a complaint," he said, avoiding my eyes, "that your boathouse is not in compliance with current structural codes." I led him down to the small, ancient boathouse. It was old, but my grandfather had built it with solid oak beams, and it was as sturdy as a bunker. The inspector poked and prodded, tapped on the beams, and measured the foundation. "It's old, but it's built better than any of the new ones," he finally conceded. "It's perfectly sound. I don't know what the complainant was talking about." He filed his report and left. A week later, a truck from the Department of Fish and Wildlife pulled into my driveway. This time, the complaint was that I was using illegal, non-native bait to fish from my dock, which was allegedly attracting vermin and upsetting the lake's delicate ecosystem. A young, polite game warden followed me down to the dock and asked to see my tackle box. I opened it, revealing a neat collection of artificial lures, spinners, and flies. "I only use artificial lures," I told him. "I practice catch and release." The warden looked through the box, his expression one of weary apology. "Yeah, I see that. No live bait here? Ma'am on the phone was pretty insistent you were using. I think she said imported leeches." He shook his head. "Sorry to waste your time, sir." During his visit, I engaged him in a conversation about the lake. I asked about the water quality, the stocking programs, the challenges of maintaining a healthy fish population. He was impressed by my knowledge. "You know a lot about this stuff," he said. "I've always been interested in conservation," I replied. "In fact, my family's foundation has supported some habitat restoration projects in the past." It was an understatement. My philanthropic trust had funded entire river cleanups. Out of curiosity, I asked, what would it cost to do a full ecological survey and a multi-year stocking and management plan for a lake of this size? The question was unusual, far beyond the scope of a normal homeowner's interest. The warden gave me a strange look, then quoted a figure that would have made most people's eyes water. I just nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting," I said. "Thank you for the information." He left, and I was alone again with my thoughts. Eleanor was running out of ammunition. Her official complaints were being dismissed, her lies exposed. I knew that her desperation would lead her to a final, more direct confrontation. The report from my wealth manager about the lake's ownership sat on my desk like a sleeping giant. The time to awaken it was drawing near. The final confrontation, the event that pushed me from passive defense to decisive action, was born of Eleanor's sheer, unadulterated rage at her own failures. For weeks, she had thrown every bit of her petty power at me, and I had quietly, calmly, and legally weathered the storm. Her inability to bend me to her will had become a festering obsession. I had decided, in a small act of personal defiance, to ignore her fishing ban. It was my home, my dock, and the simple act of casting a line was a connection to my father that I was no longer willing to sacrifice for her absurd rules. I took to fishing in the early morning, just as the sun was rising, a time of day when the lake was still and quiet, and Eleanor was, I assumed, still asleep. I was wrong. She had clearly been watching my house, waiting for me to slip up. One crisp morning, as I was reeling in a small, feisty bass, I heard her voice, sharp and triumphant, cut through the quiet air. "Got you." I turned. She was standing at the edge of my lawn, not alone this time, but flanked by two other stony-faced members of the HOA board. It was a public ambush, a deliberately staged confrontation. She held up her phone, which was clearly recording. "Thomas Anderson," she announced, her voice filled with the grandiosity of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "You are in flagrant and repeated violation of Bylaw 101 concerning recreational activities on Azure Springs Lake. This is your third documented offense." She strode forward, her two companions following like obedient wolves. She was holding a clipboard, and attached to it was a formal-looking invoice. "As per the HOA's schedule of escalating penalties," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Your previous fines have been compounded. The board held an emergency meeting last night and has voted to levy the maximum cumulative penalty for your continued and willful defiance." She thrust the invoice at me. "That is a fine for $600. Due immediately." I looked at the piece of paper, then at her smug, triumphant face. It wasn't about the money. $600 was less than the cost of a single bottle of wine at some of the restaurants Mark dragged me to. It was about the principle. It was about her absolute conviction that she had the right to control every aspect of my life on my own property. "And this," she said, her voice dropping to a low, threatening growl, "is just the beginning. We will fine you every single day you are in violation. We will place a lien on your house for unpaid dues. We will use the full weight of the HOA's legal counsel to make it so financially painful for you that you will have no choice but to sell this property." She gestured at my modest cottage with a look of utter contempt. "And believe me, we already have a list of pre-approved buyers who are eager to tear this shack down and build something appropriate for this community. You are not welcome here, Mr. Anderson, and we will continue to turn up the pressure until you are gone." It was all there. The threat, the motivation, the endgame. She was openly admitting to a campaign of harassment designed to force me out of my home so she could replace it with something that better suited her aesthetic sensibilities. She was using the HOA's financial power, the threat of liens and legal fees, to try and bleed a man she believed to be house poor into submission. I looked from her hate-filled face to the two impassive board members, then back to the invoice for $600. I took it from her hand. For a moment, she thought she had won. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. I looked her directly in the eye, my expression calm, my voice even. "Thank you for this," I said, folding the invoice neatly and putting it in my pocket. "It's the final piece of documentation I needed." I turned my back on them, picked up my fishing rod, and deliberately cast my line back into the water. Her shriek of impotent rage as I did so was the sweetest sound I had heard all summer. The war was over. I had lost all the small battles. And in doing so, I had just won the entire campaign. The annual meeting of the Azure Springs Homeowners Association was a grand affair, held in the community's opulent clubhouse. It was a place of polished brass, dark wood, and hushed, self-important tones. I had never attended before, but this year, I had circled the date on my calendar. I arrived early and took a seat at the back. Just another anonymous resident in a room full of people who had been taught to despise me. Eleanor Vance, seated at a long table at the front of the room, like a queen holding court, was in her element. She moved through the agenda with a brisk, practiced efficiency, her voice radiating an unshakable confidence. Finally, she reached the agenda item I had been waiting for: bylaw enforcement and delinquent accounts. Her eyes scanned the room and found me. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. "As many of you know," she began, her voice filled with a somber gravity, "the board takes its fiduciary duty to maintain our community's standards and property values very seriously. Unfortunately, we have a resident who has shown a consistent and willful disregard for our bylaws." She did not use my name, but every head in the room turned to look at me. I could feel their collective scorn and disapproval. "This resident of Lot 42," she continued, "has accrued numerous fines for violations ranging from unapproved landscaping to prohibited recreational activities. These fines now total several $1,000s. The resident has refused all attempts at communication and has failed to pay any of the outstanding balance. She paused for dramatic effect, letting the weight of my alleged crimes settle over the room. Therefore, she declared, her voice ringing with authority, the board has voted unanimously to take the most serious step at our disposal. We have directed our legal counsel to place a formal lien on the property of Lot 42 and to immediately begin foreclosure proceedings. We will not allow one individual to undermine the integrity of our entire community. A murmur of approval went through the room. This was it. The public execution. She had won. She had beaten the unsightly pauper and was about to seize his property. She looked directly at me, her eyes gleaming with victory. Before the board formally ratifies this action, she said, her voice dripping with condescension, does the resident of Lot 42 have anything to say in his defense? I stood up slowly. The room was silent. I walked from the back of the room to the front, my footsteps echoing on the polished floor. I was not carrying a binder of evidence or a prepared speech. I was carrying a slim, leather-bound portfolio. I arrived at the podium, placed the portfolio down, and looked out at the assembled residents. Then I turned to Eleanor. "Thank you, Eleanor," I said, my voice calm and clear. "I do, in fact, have an announcement to make. It's not a defense. It's more of a clarification, specifically regarding the lake." A confused ripple went through the room. "You see," I continued, "I was so impressed by the HOA's passion for managing the lake that I decided to do a little research. And I was very surprised to learn that the Azure Springs HOA doesn't actually own the lake. It doesn't own the water, the lakebed, or the shoreline. All of that was still the property of the original developer, a company called Azure Springs Holdings LLC. I opened my portfolio. My research also indicated that Azure Springs Holdings has been in significant financial distress for several years. They were, it turns out, highly motivated to divest themselves of their last major, non-performing asset. I looked directly at Eleanor, whose confident smirk had been replaced by a look of wary confusion. "So, last month, I had my private equity firm, Anderson Capital, reach out to them. The negotiations were quite straightforward, and I am pleased to announce that as of 9 o'clock this morning, the deal was finalized. Anderson Capital has acquired 100% of Azure Springs Holdings, LLC, and with it, all of its assets." I slid a thick, blue-backed document out of the portfolio and placed it on the podium for all to see. It was a freshly recorded deed. "The primary asset, of course," I said, my voice ringing through the silent room, "is the entirety of Azure Springs Lake, including the water, the lakebed, the dam, and all of the surrounding shoreline up to the legally defined high water mark." I paused, letting the information sink in. The expressions on the faces in front of me shifted from scorn to stunned disbelief. "So, Eleanor," I said, turning to her, "regarding the $600 fine for fishing in what you claimed was the HOA's lake, I'm afraid I won't be paying it. Because as of this morning, you were attempting to fine me for fishing in my own, privately owned lake." A collective gasp went through the room, but I wasn't finished. "And I have one more announcement for the community," I said, turning back to the audience. "As the new owner of the lake, I am, effective immediately, designating it as private property. All HOA bylaws, rules, and regulations concerning the use of the lake, the shoreline, or any activities thereupon are now null and void. They are superseded by my sole authority as the owner." I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the people who had snubbed and slandered me. Access to the lake for boating and recreation will continue, but it will be by private permit only, issued by me, to residents who are respectful of their neighbors. My own property, Lot 42, is of course exempt from all such permitting requirements in perpetuity. And fishing, I added, a small, triumphant smile finally touching my lips, is now highly encouraged. I looked at Eleanor. Her face had gone from a furious crimson to a sickly, sheet white. Her jaw was slack, her eyes wide with horrified comprehension. Her entire kingdom, the source of all her power and prestige, had been bought out from under her in a single, silent transaction. She was a queen with no country. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She had been utterly and completely defeated. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and brutal for Eleanor Vance. Her power base, built entirely on her control over the community's primary asset, had been obliterated in a single, stunning announcement. She was a general with no army. The residents, who had once feared her, now saw her for what she was, a powerless bully. An emergency board meeting was called the following evening, and in a unanimous vote of no confidence, she was stripped of her presidency. The community itself was in an uproar, but their fear of a new, all-powerful lake lord quickly subsided. I had no interest in being a tyrant. I worked with the new, reasonable HOA board to establish a simple, common-sense set of rules for lake access. The ridiculous restrictions were gone, replaced by basic guidelines for safety and respect. The annual lake usage fee that Eleanor had imposed was abolished. Instead, I established a voluntary lake preservation fund, managed by the new board, to pay for upkeep and ecological programs. And I made the first donation myself, a sum that dwarfed what the HOA could have collected in fees in a decade. Humiliated, stripped of her power, and now a social pariah in the community she had once ruled, Eleanor could not bear to stay. Within 3 months, a for sale sign was planted on her manicured lawn. The day she moved out, the entire neighborhood seemed to exhale in collective relief. My life at Azure Springs was transformed. The cold shoulders and suspicious glares were replaced by friendly waves and tentative smiles. I was no longer the problem property, but the eccentric but benevolent benefactor who had freed them from a dictator. Neighbors would stop by to chat, to ask for fishing tips, to thank me for buying the lake. It was the sense of community I had hoped to find all along. One warm evening, a few weeks after Eleanor had gone, I was on my dock, casting a line into the water as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. A neighbor, a man who had been one of Eleanor's staunchest supporters at the annual meeting, walked hesitantly down to the dock, 2 cold beers in his hand. "Evening, Tom," he said, his voice a bit sheepish. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," I said, smiling. He handed me a beer and sat on the edge of the dock. We sat in a comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the water. "You know," he said finally, "I just wanted to say, I was wrong about you. We were all wrong. What you did, it was the best thing that ever happened to this place." "I just wanted to fish," I said, reeling in my line. "Well," he said with a small laugh, "you certainly found a way to do that." I looked out at the tranquil water, at the beautiful lake that was now, improbably, mine. Mark's words came back to me. "There's nothing normal about you, Tom." Maybe he was right. I had tried to live a normal life, but I had been forced to use abnormal means to protect it. But as I took a sip of my beer and watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more satisfying than any I had ever known. I had bought my peace, and it was worth every penny.